It's the first working day of the year for most of the country, and here with us to discuss the earliest economic indicators coming through this 2026, we have with us Professor JC Punongbayan, Assistant Prof over at the UP School of Economics. Good morning, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Danny, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Now, your reaction first to the PMI, no, which finally we see it above 50, so some month-on-month improvements there. But that comes also on the back of, it was mentioned earlier in the broadcast, still some weaknesses that we see in the manufacturing sector. Give us your insights on this figure and whether we will see more expansion as we move towards the new year.
Well, Danny, the PMI is some sort of cyclical bellwether for the economy. So it kind of signals the level of economic activity and also the optimism, especially when it comes to manufacturing. And of course, we have to take note that back in November, there was a severe slump in the PMI. I think it fell sharply to 47.4 or thereabouts. And there's a clear contraction in that regard. And of course, that comes on the back of the news. In the third quarter of 2025, GDP growth was just 4%, which is way below the government's targets. So I think there's some sort of cautious optimism moving into 2026 about the state of manufacturing. But for economists like me, we're quite concerned about the general direction of manufacturing in the sense that we're clearly being left behind, for example, by countries like Vietnam when it comes to manufacturing and industry.
Does this sprint change with your outlook on the trade wars or the impact of tariffs on the country this year? Give us an idea of whether the export sector will be rebounding.
Well, moving into 2026, Danny, there are still huge question marks regarding the direction of global trade, especially since the announcement of Donald Trump of a severe increase in tariffs back in April of 2025. Although some economists kind of overestimated the impact of the tariffs in the sense that Donald Trump himself kind of backtracked on the tariff war, and we've yet to see the full extent of the impact of those tariffs on the global stage. Meanwhile, for the Philippines, we're still awaiting the policy direction from the US when it comes to semiconductors. Of course, semiconductors comprise the biggest share of our exports as well as our imports, and any kind of policy on semiconductors, especially a planned increase of tariffs on semiconductors up to 100%, will have a significant impact on our own trade. So we're waiting for these developments moving into 2026.
Indeed, we had Dan La Chica of SAPI also throughout the holidays, hoping, of course, that this double-digit increase in exports and semiconductors will continue throughout this year. Let's go to another point in the headlines, which is the national debt. So in the month of November, the total borrowings jumped by close to 75% compared to the same month a year ago. Now, it was mentioned earlier on, this might be a seasonal thing. It's the end of the year. But, compared to year on year, such a jump. Give us your thoughts on why we needed so much debt in November.
Well, the general trend is that there's a ballooning of the debt in general. I think the total debt right now, outstanding debt of the Philippine government would be amounting to, I think, more than 17 trillion pesos. And the more importantly, when you look at the debt to GDP ratio, it's above 63%. You have to remember that the target of the Marcos administration back in 2022 was a decline of the debt to GDP ratio to below 60%. But we're moving in the opposite direction. The debt continues to balloon. And it's not exactly surprising because, number one, tax revenues are kind of, also not quite what the government expected. The government is scrambling to increase its government revenues and boost the tax effort. And at the same time, we have lots of governance issues concerning government spending, culminating, of course, with the creation of the ICI, and we're still awaiting the arrest of many personalities involved in the flood control scandal. So I'm afraid that many of these spending issues will continue to hound us into 2026 and also have a bearing on the debt situation.
But Prof, just on that point, no, what is not clear for me is why is it that the debt ballooned when the spending of the government went down significantly after all of these probes into the flood control projects?
Yes, we have to note that one of the reasons for the decline of GDP or the decline of the growth rate of GDP back in the third quarter was a decline in spending, specifically for government construction projects under the DPWH. But we have to remember that this is only part of the total spending of the Philippine government, notwithstanding the reduction in government public works. There's still a huge deficit, and the spending of the government is still way larger compared to the revenues that it earns. I'm afraid that even if you remove all of the corrupt projects of the government, we will still have to incur a significant deficit. So that is the extent of the deficit, and that, of course, has a direct bearing on the debt situation.
Is that worrying for you or worrying for debt watchers? We just had S&P, give us a triple B plus with a positive outlook at least for the long term. So is this going to have an impact? These figures?
Well, it is quite worrying because we're still very far from the pre-pandemic debt to GDP ratio of less than 40%. You will remember that I think back in 2019, it's around 39%. And of course, the significant debt will eat away or kind of crowd out important spending, specifically on human capital development like education and health. It would be good if the amounts that we borrow are actually spent wisely, specifically on education and health. But what we're seeing is that a significant chunk of the debt is actually being poured into corrupted or corruptible public works as well. So it's a double whammy for us. Our debt is ballooning, and at the same time, the money that we're borrowing is not being spent well. So, of course, incurring a debt per se is not bad, but you have to spend that money wisely.
Let's circle back to the reenacted budget. First time since PBBM or the administration started in 2022. We're still waiting on his signature, whether he will veto some things. And just to remind us, our viewers here, in 2024, so 2 years ago, the president vetoed close to 200 billion pesos worth of items. What are you watching out for here, Prof? And will this have a significant impact on the economy if it takes a while for the budget to be approved?
Well, let's go back to 2019, the last time we had the reenacted budget. You will remember that the budget for 2019 was signed only in the middle of April 2019. And funnily enough, the 2019 budget was also stymied by allegations of pork insertions involving the budget secretary, former budget secretary Benjamin Jokno, and also alleged insertions of former House Speaker Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. And there was an impasse as well surrounding these alleged pork insertions. And also, I take note that there were some adjustments or realignments in the budget after the BICAM ratification back in end of 2018. So we're being hounded by these problems. Many of the problems that we're seeing now with the 2026 budget are kind of echoes of what had happened back in 2018 and 2019. But I don't think that a few days or a few weeks of reenacted budget will have a significant impact on the economy. I guess few will remember actually that, or few will remember the economic impact of the reenacted budget back in 2019. I think there was a slowdown in government spending, but there was by no means any crisis that happened or any kind of economic crisis that happened by virtue of having a reenacted budget. So I think the fears about a reenacted budget are quite overblown, but I'm more worried about the underlying governance issues that led to the reenacted budget in the first place.
Okay, so wait and see mode, hopefully sooner rather than later. Let's go to one issue which is, of course, linked to the trust and the transparency issue. It's about easing bank secrecy laws here in the Philippines, especially for those public workers. Give us your thoughts on that. Is this an answer to building investor confidence, something that the IMF has been touting?
Well, I just hope that they had acted sooner. For example, I think there have been many waves of freezing of assets of personalities involved in the flood control scandal, but maybe they could have done that earlier. So I think there's an issue about whether or to what extent the AMLAC should be proactive when it comes to these governance and corruption issues. And I think it's high time that we reviewed our policies on this so to make them more responsive to the sentiment of the people and also the persistent governance issues. So I think there are gaps there because I doubt that it was a total surprise for bank officials, for example, in certain private banks and even government banks, that so much money is flowing through the banking system linked to these corruption issues. So I think there's a need to review the policies when it comes to this.
But on the other hand, no, with if we open up bank secrecy, would that not perhaps discourage some investors or people that, there's a lot of power in looking into accounts? Will that not impact the business sector?
Well, I think even now, without significant reforms when it comes to AMLAC, there are already concerns from the business sector. So I think the better way to regain the trust of the business sector on the government and the Philippine government would be to fix the broader and deeper governance issues that are hounding us, and rather than the worries when it comes to a stronger AMLAC.
Let's move over to the inflation story and possible last rate cut. We had 5 straight 25 bip reductions in the benchmark by the Bangko Sentral last year. They're saying that maybe one more is on the table. What good could this do, Prof, especially since the inflation is well below target or has been last year? Is that not enough?
Well, this is a very good example of how the Bangko Sentral kind of takes up the cudgels when it comes to propping up economic growth. Because of the governance issues hounding us, it's the decision on the prerogative of the BSP to kind of take up the cudgels and stimulate the economy through lower interest rates. And this is a pattern that's also apparent in other countries when fiscal policy is kind of weak. Because of whether it's spending issues or whatever, the monetary authorities kind of step up to boost growth. But I just wish that we can have sufficient growth even without rate cuts, because you want to have that buffer as well when it comes to the interest rates as well as macroeconomic monetary policy. I think the inflation situation is not so worrisome now, and I think we should revisit where growth comes from. Of course, in the short run, we can rely on monetary policy to boost growth. However, I'm much more concerned about the long-run trajectory of the Philippine economy. Why is it that we had just a 4% growth rate of GDP in the third quarter of 2025? What can we do to boost growth further and bring that up back to its pre-pandemic levels of more than 6% consistently? I doubt that we can rely forever on monetary policy in this regard.
And on that note, last question here. What is your outlook for GDP? Are we going to be reaching the 6% at least?
Well, it's getting harder and harder to do that. Multilateral organizations are forecasting, I think, 5% growth, for a little over 5% growth for 2026. But again, it saddens me that it's become a lot harder for us to reach 6% growth. And in fact, we saw 4% back in the third quarter. So we need more and newer growth drivers for the Philippine economy. And of course, I think we need to fix the underlying governance issues, because at the end of the day, it affects business confidence and also the inflow of investments, both portfolio investments and also, more importantly, foreign direct investments in the Philippines. So we need to fix our governance issues first before we can see much higher growth in the future.
All right, so base case will be sub 6%, but you never know. There might be some good surprises there, and hopefully we get to that would be a good thing for us. Thank you so much for your insights. JC Punongbayan, Assistant Professor over at the UP School of Economics.